Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Here we are from the fourth group. We will present about clause as representation. Clause as representation means as a clause seen from its function as a tool to represent something, namely as a tool to describe everything that happens, whether it happens outside or inside the human body. Clause as representation consists of process that denote by verbs and then participant that denote by nominal group, whether it is object or subject, and circumstance that denote by adverbial group, prepositional phrase, and adjunct. Here is the example of clause as representation. The lion chased the tourist lazily through the bush. The lion as the participant, chase it is verb that it means include into process, and the tourist as the receiver from the verb or as the participant to, and then lazily through the bush, it's called a circumstance. Here is the table of process and their component. There are 6 processes in clause as representation, that is material, mental, relational, behavioral, verbal, and existential process. Each type of this process has their own name of participant. Participant 1 in material process called as actor, while the participant 2 called as goal. Mental process in the participant 1 called as sensor, while the participant 2 called as phenomenon. In relational process, participant 1 called as carrier or identified, while the participant 2 called as attribute or identifier. In behavioral process, it only need one participant that called behavior, while in verbal process, it called sayer as the participant 1 and receiver or target as the participant 2, while the existential, it same with the behavioral process that they only need one participant that called existent. Jadi, setiap partisipan itu penyebutannya tergantung proses apa yang dia lalui. Misalkan prosesnya termasuk pada material, berarti dia disebutnya actor atau goal. Atau ketika prosesnya termasuk ke dalam mental proses, berarti dia disebutnya sebagai sensor atau phenomenon. Begitu seterusnya. And then, main types of circumstance. There are 4 types of circumstance. Extent that explain about duration or distance, for example, for 3 hours. Location that explain about place and time, for example, in June from Paris. Manner means quality, comparison, for example, like with a hammer. And then cause that specify as reason, purpose, behave, for example, like to do my job. Okay, we go to the next explanation. The first one is material process or process of doing. They express the notion that some participant, called as actor, does something to other entity that called goal. Material process use verbs of action such as run, kick, climb, spring, and etc. Here is the example of material process. The boy kicked the ball in the yard. In this sentence, the verb is used verb action, that is kick, so the participant 1 called as actor, while the participant 2 called as goal. The boy as actor means as the participant, kick verb action means include into material process, that's called as process. The ball as the participant 2 means as a goal, and then in the yard it's mean the location that is include into circumstance. The second one, mental process or process of perception, affection, and cognition. These are expressed by a verb of feeling, perceiving, and thinking, such as like, hate, love, know, think, and understand, and etc. Here, the participant have different names of sensor, the conscious being animate or inanimate, that is have feeling, thinking, or seeing, and phenomenon which is sent or felt. For example, for the perception, we heard the bell at night. The verb in this sentence use heard. It means that perception of mental process. So the participant 1 use we called as sensor, while the participant 2 we called as phenomenon. We as sensor, called as participant. Heard mental process means that it is the process. The bell, it is the participant 2 that called as phenomenon. And at night, it's explained about the time, so it's included into circumstance. Other example of affection. I love him so much. I, as the participant 1, called as sensor, love as the process that include into mental process, and then him as the participant 2 that called as phenomenon, so much as the circumstance. And the last example is cognition. Lisa knows Dio's secret. Lisa as the participant 1 as called sensor, knows as the mental process that include into process, and Dio's secret as the participant 2 that called as phenomenon. For the next explanation, it will explained by Nabila Hauluki and Nuriana Wanti.
So the third is relational process. Relational process is a process about the state or condition of someone or something. Jadi, relational process ini merupakan suatu proses tentang keadaan atau kondisi seseorang atau sesuatu. Type of relational process has two forms. Relational process ini memiliki dua bentuk, yaitu attributive and identifier. The first is attributive. In the attributive form, an attribute that is attached to a participant can be quality, state, time, place, or as ownership. Jadi dalam bentuk atributif ini, partisipan bisa menjadi kualitas yang mensifati ataupun menerangkan kualitas dari partisipan sebelumnya. Atau intensif, bisa juga menjadi sirkumstansial, yaitu menerangkan tentang tempat, keadaan, waktu, dan lain-lain. Atau juga bisa menerangkan tentang kepemilikan atau possessive. The participants are called carrier and attribute. So the second is identifying. Meanwhile, in the form of identifying, one element is used to identify another element. Sedangkan dalam bentuk identifying, elemen yang satu itu digunakan untuk mengidentifikasi elemen yang lain. The participant disebut sebagai identified dan identifier. So for the example of attribute clause, the first is intensive atau yang menerangkan tentang kualitas. Sarah is wise. Sarah as career, is as relational process, wise as attribute. So the second is circumstantial atau yang menerangkan tentang keadaan, waktu, dan tempat. Sarah is at home. Sarah as career, is as relational process, at home, attribute. So the last is possessive atau yang menerangkan tentang kepemilikan. Sarah has a pet. Sarah as career, has as relational process, a pet as attribute. So the next is the example of identifying clause. Contoh dari identifying clause yaitu Mr. Al played the piano. Mr. Al as identified, played as relational process, the piano as identifier. Nadine is the clever one. Nadine as identified is as relational process, the clever one as identifier. Nino is Elsa's husband. Nino as identified is as relational process. Elsa's husband as identifier. The most basic difference between the two is that the identifying clause is reversible, while the attribute clause cannot. Perbedaan paling mendasar antara identifying clause dan attributive clause adalah di mana identifying clause itu dapat dibolak-balik antara partisipan 1 dan partisipan 2. Contoh, Nino is Elsa's husband bisa dibalik menjadi Elsa's husband is Nino. So, the identifying clause has a passive form, while the attributive clause hasn't. Identifying clause ini memiliki bentuk yang pasif, sedangkan attributive clause tidak. So, the next is about behavioral process. Behavioral process expressed by verb such as skulk, yawn, smile, breathe, faint, worry, and etc. Jadi behavioral process ini mengekspresikan atau diekspresikan oleh kata kerja atau verbs. Only one participant is required. Hanya satu partisipan yang dibutuhkan. This participant is termed the behavior. Partisipan ini disebut dengan behavior. For the example, they laugh loudly. They as behavior, loud behavioral process, loudly as quality. He frowns. He as behavior, frown as behavioral process.
Okay, I will explain about verbal processes and existential processes. Verbal processes or processes of saying. This is a large category that not only includes the different modes of saying, asking, commanding, offering, stating, but also semiotic processes that are not necessarily verbal, showing, indicating. The central participant is the sayer. The verbiage is what is said and the target or receiver is the person it is said to. Here are some examples of verbal processes. First is statement. He told me a story. He, as a sayer, this is a participant 1. Told as a verbal processes, this is a process. Me as a receiver or participant 2 add a story as a verbiage as a circumstances. And then common. He scored his horse. He as a sayer, participant 1, scored verbal process as a process and his horse as a target is a participant 2. And then question. Ali asked Tony, whose book is that? Ali as a sayer, participant 1, asked verbal process as a process, Tony, receiver, participant 2, and whose book is that as a verbiage, circumstances. And then over. I invited Rena to my house. I as a sayer, participant 1, invited verbal process, Rena as a target, participant 2, to my house as a circumstances. And then existential processes. This represents that something exists or happens. In these cases, what we are doing is affirming the existence of something or someone. In these clauses, there acts as a grammatical subject, but it doesn't fulfill any function outside of its grammatical role. The only significant element is the thing or person being affirmed as existing. There is only one participant called existent. Okay, for example, there was an old man. There as a grammatical subject. Was as an existential process as a process. An old man as a participant or existent. And then there seems to be a problem. And then there hangs a picture on the wall. There as a grammatical subject hangs as the existential process or process, a picture as the existent or participant, and then on the wall as a circumstances. Okay, enough from our group. And thanks for your attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.